welcome to this week's episode of M Squared Anonymous with Maeve and Michelle. In 2016, Jezebel published a piece called Interview with a Woman Who Recently Had an Abortion at 32 Weeks. Conducted via phone by writer Gia Tolentino, the interview explores one woman's painful experience getting a late-term abortion. The interview subject remains anonymous. A disclaimer at the top of the piece notes that she is 35, currently lives in Brooklyn, and that after a previous miscarriage at 10 weeks, she was overjoyed to find herself pregnant for a second time. However, at 31 weeks, she found out that the baby boy she was carrying wouldn't be able to breathe outside the womb and would not survive.
Okay, so here's a little bit of context for our listeners. In its simplest form, an abortion is a medical procedure to end a pregnancy. Politically, abortion is so much more than that. It's historically a very volatile subject. Most notably, there is pro-choice and pro-life. A pro-choice supporter believes that it's a woman's right to make decisions regarding her own body, while on the pro-life side, supporters argue that once a fetus has been formed, there's human life and it's our moral obligation to preserve that life. Now, although I describe two sides, abortion is not black and white. There are a variety of circumstances that are considered. For instance, women who have been sexually abused or raped, or in the case of our article today, a woman who planned on carrying to term but was faced with a myriad of intense medical issues during her pregnancy that put both her and the child's life at risk past 21 weeks. Now, back in 2016, when this article was published, abortion was a passionate topic of debate between presidential candidates Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. Today, it continues to be a topic of contention between the two political parties. Trump's latest pick for Supreme Court, conservative Catholic Amy Coney Barrett, put this issue in the spotlight again during this year's presidential election. Her vote, alongside a conservative majority, could make the difference for decades ahead on divisive issues like abortion rights.
All right, so let's discuss the story we have today. Right off the bat, Michelle, what do you think? Do you think granting anonymity was necessary?
Well, to me, I think it was already a compelling story on its own. I'm not sure it would have added much to the story if she were a private citizen. I think maybe if she were a public figure, that might be a different story. It would obviously be interesting if like a politician with strong religious values was the subject of the story. So it's kind of tricky to say since we don't know exactly who this woman is. What do you think?
I agree. I mean, it's hard to know. Like, I would assume that she would not have been willing to do the interview had she been named. At least I assume that because she wasn't named. And the entire story kind of consists of the interview. So it's hard to know, but seemingly, I mean, I would think granting anonymity was necessary.
Yeah, and it's obviously a really sensitive and misunderstood topic. So I understand her motivations for wanting to be anonymous, for fear of that backlash. Having the world know such a private thing about you would be a difficult situation to be in. I did think one part of the story was interesting, though. She has this like anecdote about her boss knowing about it. So that obviously makes me wonder, like, realistically, how many people like don't know about it that know her, like.
Right. And I mean, that kind of goes into like, did she suffer any consequences as a result of the story? It's like, seemingly no, although we can't really know because we don't know who she is. We don't know her. She's not a public figure. But it is kind of scary to think about like what kind of consequences she might have faced had she kind of attached her name to this, because it is such a controversial thing and because people do have such harsh reactions when they hear about stories like this.
Do you think that maybe sharing her identity could have made the piece more impactful for like in terms of making it more relatable for other women who are going through the same thing? Or
yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I think there's definitely a chance that could have made it more impactful. I think it's just like, I can imagine, I mean, it's seemingly just very hard to find a person who's gone through such a traumatic experience and is willing to not only talk about it, but kind of like attach their name to it, which is why like this issue is so misunderstood, I would assume.
Yeah.
The question, is it robust without the use of a private citizen's personal details? This story certainly delves into a private citizen's personal details.
Mm-hmm. Or allegedly private citizen.
Right.
But yeah, like the story definitely has like in-depth details around her pregnancy and the issues she faced prior to like the decision to having the abortion.
I think a lot of the time an anonymous source, especially when it's so heavily relied on, does tend to undermine the credibility of the report. But I thought reading this interview, just like the level of detail in it and like also just like, and I don't know how great it is to go off emotions, but just like the way it really like puts you in her place really made me see this situation from like an angle and like a perspective that like I never had before.
I think that's definitely a sign of good journalism, and her responses were super candid. Like I felt the same way as you. Like she was telling a story that was distinctive to her own experience, and in a lot of cases of anonymity, it can be construed as like undermining the credibility. But in this case, like it allowed her to speak freely without that kind of fear of being stigmatized.
Yeah. And I guess just to wrap up, like, could Gia Tolentino have written this story without relying on anonymous sources?
Yeah, perhaps. I feel like kind of going back to the whole like credibility thing, like my only concern here would have been that since it was framed as a Q&A story, the reporter didn't really corroborate anything that she was saying.
Mm-hmm.
There's no testimony from the doctor, the husband doesn't come in to confirm anything. There's no evidence like about her trip to Colorado. It's possible,
Mm-hmm.
probably unlikely that the entire story could have been like made up by a passionate pro-choice advocate. I mean, we live in a crazy world, so
Mm-hmm.
we have to be skeptical.
Definitely. Um, yeah, it's interesting to consider what this story would have looked like in like a completely different format. But I guess there are other similar stories like this, and this is just kind of one example of how this is.
I came across that statistic too that said that there's out of like 73 million abortions worldwide, 1.2% occur after 21 weeks. So that would make
Mm-hmm.
hers pretty rare.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe he couldn't have found another source who was willing to go on the record.
Yeah, certainly. Well, thank you everyone for listening today. This has been M Squared Anonymous. Please tune in next week.